Hi, I want to talk to you today about rights and responsibilities within the employer-employee relationship. What responsibilities do employers have to their employees? What rights do employees have? Those are in some sense not exactly the same question, but very similar questions. And conversely, what are the responsibilities of the employees? What rights does an employer have? Those are things we want to investigate, and we're in the process of doing that from the perspective of various philosophical theories. Well, today I want to focus on consequentialism. What can the consequentialists say about the rights and responsibilities in general, but specifically within that employer-employee relationship? There are a variety of reasons why we might think that a consequentialist approach is helpful here. It might be a general commitment to consequentialism as a moral theory, to thinking that in the end all value really comes down to the value of consequences, and we prefer situations that tend to have better consequences. But it might be something else. We might simply say, I get the perspective of the Kantian that we have to treat everyone else with respect and apply the same rules to everyone. I get the idea of common sense ethics, that we have to keep our promises and make amends when things go wrong, that we have to be fair to everyone, and that we have to not place people in a condition of harm or even risk. All of that's important, but on the other hand, you might say, it looks like these things can come into conflict. Now in Ross, that's explicit. Yes, these things can come into conflict. It might be that the only way to be fair to people, for example, is actually to put them all at risk. It might be a situation where really making amends for something that's gone wrong in the past is going to harm people now. There can be complicated trade-offs among these various kinds of considerations. And how do we make those trade-offs? How do we make the comparisons and judge what to do in the end when we do have a situation of moral conflict, where more than one moral consideration applies? Ross himself doesn't give us much help. In fact, he quotes Aristotle as saying, well, in the end, the decision rests with perception. In other words, the sensitive person just gets a sense of what to do. That's not very helpful. And so we might say, well, in the end, maybe that's true. We just trust the people we think are virtuous and rely on them to be sensitive to the considerations and apply things correctly and make the right judgment. But we'd like to have some theoretical guidance. What are these virtuous people to do? How do we develop that kind of sensitivity? Similarly, in Kant, since there's one moral principle, the idea is supposed to be that conflicts can't arise. But it looks as if that's not true. The classic case of the murderer at the door, the person who's knocking, you've hid someone who is their intended victim, and the murderer comes to the door and wants to know if you've seen them and if you know where they are. Should you tell the truth? Well, it looks like a concern for your friend's life now comes into conflict with a duty to tell the truth. And so it appears in Kant's framework that it's possible for moral conflicts to arise. What do we do? And within Kant's framework, it's hard to know how to answer those questions. The consequentialist, on the other hand, seems to give us a way. Says there's a scale. So in Bentham, in John Stuart Mill, we have a scale of values. We are to prefer actions that have better consequences, or at least that tend to have better consequences. And so we think about the expected consequences of actions, we place them on a scale, we say, more happiness, better, okay? Less happiness, more unhappiness, worse. And then we have some cutoff that determines actual rights and responsibilities, and that's a little complicated, as we'll see in a moment. But that's the general idea. We look to that. And so the Bentham actually says, look, the great advantage of this framework is that we have a scale. We aren't put in a situation where we have to say, yes, sometimes we have to make trade-offs and there are moral conflicts and I don't know what to do. No, consequentialism can say, I know what to do. Compare the expected consequences. And sometimes they might be even. Well, then choose which one you want. But in other cases, one is going to have better expected consequences. Choose that one. So there is an advantage to this. But what does that say about rights and responsibilities? Well, within the basic framework, responsibilities are tricky. Both Bentham and Mill seem to waffle about this question. They frame the principle of utility in terms of a scale, in terms of comparatives. They say the degree, basically, of rightness of an action is proportional to the tendency it has to improve the happiness of the community. And so that's a proportional question. It's a matter of better and worse, not really a question of what you must do and what rights people have. So that's a more abstract question. Now, even determining responsibilities, what you really ought to do or what you must do, that becomes tricky. So you might think you should always choose the best available option. And that's called maximizing consequentialism. You might think it's enough to choose one above a certain threshold, whatever that is. Maybe some things are good enough that you don't always have to choose absolutely the best one. You can choose other things as long as they're good enough. So there's a difference in this sort of theory between what you must do at least one of these, and what you really ideally ought to do, which is the very best one, let's say. That seems to allow for the possibility of moral saints, of what philosophers call supererogatory actions, actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. That's called satisficing utilitarianism or consequentialism. You have to do enough, but you don't necessarily have to do the very best thing. So there's already that subtlety when we think about responsibilities. But what about rights? Bentham dismisses the entire notion of rights. He says, I think rights are nonsense, and the idea of a natural right is nonsense on stilts. John Stuart Mill, however, is more tolerant of the notion. He says, no, a consequentialist can talk about rights. A right is something that society ought to protect my possession of. So, for example, do I have a right to property? Well, that becomes the question of whether society should protect my possession and use of my property. And he thinks in general, yes, that's a good thing. Why? Because of utility. Because we're better off in a framework that respects rights to property. And so we have a right to property. The same thing is true with, let's say, a right to life. Are we better off if society protects our lives, keeps people from trying to kill us, let's say? Yes, we're better off. And so that becomes a right. It is a better expected outcome if society protects that right. Well, that leads us to ask, applying this to the employer-employee relationship, what kinds of protections, what kinds of rights and responsibilities should be assigned to employers and to employees? We end up saying, well, that's a question of what society ought to protect, what society ought to establish as the rules governing that kind of relationship. And the goal here is to promote utility, that is to say, to get the best expected outcome. So the first thing to say is, in the end, for a consequentialist, it is an empirical question. What are the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees? It depends on what promotes the best employment relationship. And that's a general social question, not really a question of what's best for this particular company or these particular people, but what is best overall? Where is society better off if we establish this kind of rule governing employment or that kind of rule? So, in short, this is not the kind of question that we should expect a philosophical answer to. It's an empirical economic question. We have to think about various models of employment, see which ones work out best in practice, see what the rules are that govern those relationships, then determine rights and responsibilities on the basis of what set of rules governing that relationship is really going to have the best social consequences. There are some embarrassing questions that can be asked about a consequentialist approach to rights. Because it's like Ross's framework in a way. Rights here are not absolute. They are not trumps that override every other moral consideration. There can be conditions where they themselves are overridden. It all comes down to questions of utility, questions of attaining better consequences. And so there might be situations where the ordinary rights of an employer or an employee are set aside because the consequences of violating them are in general beneficial. Now, that can lead to some extreme objections. So, for example, people might say, well, wait, what if slavery is actually the best system of social organization for this society at this time? Does that mean slavery is okay or even obligatory? That seems disturbing. You might also say, wait, so if actually there's a big enough payoff for violating rights, for let's say having the employer not bother to pay the employees, then that's okay? That seems wrong. And so there can be situations like this where you end up saying, wait, this can't be the full story. Now, from my point of view, since I am rather eclectic and think of all of these theories as identifying different dimensions of moral thinking, then I can say, yes, it's consequentialism is identifying an important, and a very important, actually, dimension of moral thinking, but it's not the only dimension. There are other dimensions that have to be taken into account, too. Even a consequentialist, though, has something to say. They can say, look, I am talking about the long-term stability, the long-term benefit to society. I'm not saying that you judge it right now. Think about what this does for the future. So, for example, suppose you actually allow slavery as part of your overall social code. That is not, in the long run, going to be good for that society. Maybe it's actually economically beneficial at a certain time. I mean, it's not clear that it would be, but if it were, still, you might say, think about the longer-term consequences. And the same thing could be true of that decision of an employer not to pay the employees. If employees know entering into an employment contract they might not get paid, that's going to have very deep and broad social significance over the long run. And so the consequentialists in all these ways can say, look, it looks like an objection, but only because people aren't thinking hard enough about the general applicability of this rule and its long-term effects. In the short run, okay, maybe it's best actually if those employees don't get paid, but that's not something that in the long run is going to be good for a social order. It's in fact highly destabilizing. And so there are going to be ways for the consequentialists to try to defend. I don't want to prejudge this and tell you they work or they don't work. I think they're hard questions here. One of the hardest questions actually concerns human lives. What do we do when human lives are at stake? It might be that we can save a certain number of lives, but only at the cost of maybe a huge commitment of economic resources, maybe by infringing people's liberties to a very significant degree. Is it worth it? Those are hard trade-offs to make. They're real social questions. And from a consequentialist point of view, it's important to face those trade-offs and think about them hard. You can't say, as many politicians are tempted to say, oh, this is a false choice. No, in the end, a lot of things really are not false choices. In the end, saving those lives does cost a lot of money. In the end, saving those lives actually does require severe restriction of liberty. And what we do in those cases, we don't necessarily always side with the lives. We don't always side with economics or with liberty. We have to try to figure out how much, well, and this is the hard question, how much those lives are worth to us as a society. That sounds brutal, it sounds inhumane, but actually we make that decision for ourselves all the time. We've talked about that earlier in the course. There are situations where we simply have to place an economic value on human life. We could spend billions, trillions of dollars to save one life. But in fact, we're likely to think that's a bad way to spend our resources. We could save many more lives by spending that money in other ways. And the same thing might be said about our own lives. Do I always protect my own life at the expense of everything else? No. I drive a sports car. It's more dangerous than other kinds of cars. But I do it anyway because I enjoy it. I like putting the top down, even if it means that when my car flips over, I hope it never does, but in case it would, I'm in big trouble. And so we take risks with our own lives, and as a society, we risk people's lives all the time for the sake of other values. So from the consequentialist point of view, it won't do to put your head in the sand and say we should never make that kind of choice. We have to make that kind of choice. We all do it all the time. The question is, how do we do it? And that's where things get enormously difficult. How do I make those kinds of judgments? It's something that becomes a problem in general for consequentialism, and not only when lives are at stake. They're often very, very different kinds of goods, and we have to make comparative judgments among them. We have to put them on that single scale to get the advantages that consequentialism promises. But how do we take goods of very different kinds and combine them on a single scale? Bentham says, again, we do it all the time. We think about how hard we're willing to work in order to get that promotion, for example, and we're trading off our energy, our work, our time, against the possible benefits of that position. They're very different kinds of things, but we make the comparison. Yes, we do. But is there any rule that governs that? Is there any way in general for us as a society to do it, since after all, individuals seem to do it in very different ways? Those are hard questions. So, bottom line, the consequentialist is going to say there are rights and responsibilities that govern the employment relationship. What are they? It's not a philosophical question. It's a question of what in practice turns out to be the best for society at large. So we have to examine empirically what the consequences are of adopting this set of rules for employment or that set of rules. And we have to choose those that make us, well, if not best off, at least as well off as we're willing to be given other kinds of considerations. That makes us make some hard trade-offs at times, and all of these rights and responsibilities will be things that might be overridden, or might be undercut, might be intensified or attenuated, depending upon circumstances. All of those things are possible in a consequentialist framework. These are not absolute. Nevertheless, there is a ground for them, and that ground is simply what makes us all better off as a society.